we are in a series here where my goal with this series is to get us thinking about why we believe what we believe. Now, there's endless areas we could go into with this, but where we wanted to start was this idea of suffering. Because for you, like me, during this last year, we have had to come face to face with fears of suffering, some realities of suffering, and living in a place where we're constantly unsure. I've never lived in a time where I've been unsure of what the next couple months are going to look like. Is the new variant going to be as bad? Is it not? Is it? And there's been a time of really unease. Are they closing the schools again in April? Is that where we're heading? Are they closing church? All that kind of stuff. And so you live in this tension of the unknown. And so it's been difficult. Hey, but part of the difficulty is, even as I'm saying that, some of you guys are smirking because some of you guys think this is a plandemic. Where's my plandemicers? No, don't admit it. Don't do it here. Don't admit it here. Right, but part of what's made this so hard is that we don't even all agree that something's even happening. So as a nation, we have this battle going on where we're fighting over something that we don't even fully agree on. Some people are like, you need to wear 47 masks to be safe. Which, I mean, it does lead you very close to Jesus very quick if you actually put 47 masks on. Right? And some of you guys are going, no, masks are killing us. And so part of what's made this so difficult this season is the fact that it hasn't been black and white. And so then we look at what some of the governments are doing and we're like, we don't understand this, and is there something we don't know? And so now you have the infighting, and you have Elmer going to national news because we're battling with different viewpoints, and this seems to be a hot spot for this. But what we can all agree on is that it's been hard. And we've had to really come face to face with some suffering. And the reason I really wanted to start with the idea of suffering was because if we talk about wealth and happiness and joy, that's not actually a universal language. Because for some, that's never going to be their reality. But suffering is something that everybody around the world, in every culture, in every place, can relate to. And so when we as a church start thinking about what we believe, this is the one piece that we can relate to every other human being. And how we relate to those human beings tells us a lot about who we think God is and what we think our role in this is. And so the way we respond to suffering, the way we respond to moments of suffering, is something that people remember long after that moment. I did a baptism several years ago, and I was asking the person why they were getting baptized. You know, what brought you to this conclusion? And he said, well, I watched my parents suffer immensely through something, and they kept their faith, and watching them do that convinced me that God must be real. And I was like, oh man, I had a young kid at the time. Now you start thinking, you're like, you know, during happy times, people don't notice everybody as much. Like, you remember being happy, but when you go through a tragedy or a trauma, what people do really stands out. When you end up in the hospital, pre-COVID, remember when you could get visitors? You would remember who showed up. And you would also remember who didn't. Right? And you don't even mean to. It's not like we're all just nasty, terrible human beings. It's just when you're suffering, your senses are almost really heightened to that kind of stuff, and you notice stuff. Do you remember, I do, you remember the first time you were a part of the meal train here at the church? And before you were part of the meal train, you never actually understood why that mattered so much? And you're like, that's cool, we give meals to them, that's nice. And then all of a sudden you go through something tragic, and you have a bunch of people just showing up, and just out of the generosity of their heart giving you this meal, and all of a sudden you remember. And so what we do as a church during suffering is going to be remembered. This was something Andy Stanley in his new book said that has really resonated with me, but he said, this idea of asking yourself the question, what story do you want to be told of what you did in this moment? So in 5 years from now, when this is over and this is something that we're learning about and trying to learn from, what story do you want your kids to tell of how you responded to the suffering? What story do we want Malahide and Elgin to say of Mount Salem Community Church? What story do we want told of how we responded? I remember when Will came back, and I should ask him for more details before I tell the story because I've told it a few times, but wherever you were in Africa with MCC, you were somewhere, but what stood out to me was there was a Catholic priest that was there, and the remark you made was that The church had respect because when there was immense suffering, the church stayed and suffered with the people. And that has always resonated with me, that idea of just walking alongside. I don't know if you've ever had to be in a moment where somebody has suffered immensely beside you. You don't have an answer. You don't have the exact right thing, but what you do is you come alongside and you just care for them. And so as Christians, suffering is a big part of how we get to be the hands and feet of Jesus. So we wanted to start with that, and we wanted to start with asking ourselves what actually our viewpoint on suffering is, and what we're going to turn to today a bit is how we respond to suffering actually speaks volumes about who we believe God is. So, last week we talked about, and I'm just assuming I did this with the first service, and you guys look just as smart as the first service. I'm assuming you guys all did your homework. And so I just want to say thanks. Thanks for doing your homework the way I asked. Some of you guys are like, you asked us to do homework? But I'm just assuming you did. So, good work. You studied 1 Peter 3, and you read it through, because there was a lot about suffering there. Part of that was that God might actually allow us to suffer. That's what Peter seemed to think. But then there was the other part, and we used the story of the Make-A-Wish Foundation. And I don't know if you guys knew this, but first service, when I told that story, I constantly cried. So I got all my tears out when it wasn't being live streamed, and then to the second service, I was just like, boom. Because it's such a heart-wrenching story. Kid, cancer. As soon as you even say that, anybody who's a parent is just like, oh. But it wasn't about the kid's cancer, it was about the response. See, sometimes in suffering, we ask the question why, and why is important, but we get lost in the why. And with a kid dying of cancer, you could get lost in that why for years. Why would God allow this? If God is so good, why would he allow it? Why this kid? Why this family? But the Make-A-Wish Foundation is a story of somebody who said, I don't know the answer to the why, but I can certainly respond. And so they created this incredible foundation that has done so much good. But today I want to turn a little bit and ask a question about what do you believe happens when you die? What do you believe happens when you die? Because what you believe about that impacts so significantly how you respond to situations here. So let me ask you, in terms of suffering, for those who do not get redemption here, is there hope that their suffering will ever receive any justice? To those who are born into families as slaves and will die as slaves, is there any hope that at some point there will be some form of justice? Because no matter how much we try, we can't seem to give enough justice to even the people that we do help, and then there's the millions that we can't even reach. So is there any hope for them? And when we talk about suffering justice, especially in the Canadian mindset, if somebody suffers, what needs to happen? The perpetrator needs to be arrested, they need to be charged, and there needs to be consequences. But what happens when you are born a victim and you die a victim? Is there any justice? Does that ever get made right? So for Christians, one of the things we believe is that we believe there is an afterlife. We believe that when you die, this isn't the end of the story. And we believe that there is hope. And so a lot of that comes from passages like this. So Revelation 21 says, Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. And for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, a new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Look, God's dwelling place is now among his people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order has passed away. For the old order of things has passed away. So that is the hope that we cling to. And so when you go to funerals and when you think about loved ones that we've lost, it is this that we cling to, the fact that at some point we will again be reunited. We were talking this week about my grandmas, or Josie's grandmas, I guess, but we married into it. So Grandma Rempel, who we lived with for a couple of years before she passed, but she would love my boys. And I know that because she loved me and Tim. I'm not saying she loved me more than Tim, but there was indications that, whatever. So we would wrestle and we would goof around, and she just loved it. And she got so much of a kick out of it. Now I watch my boys and I just think, oh man, I can hardly wait for you to meet her. And that's the hope that we cling to. That one day that connection is going to be made. But it doesn't answer the question that we started with. Is there any justice for all the suffering? Because if we die and everybody just goes to heaven, then all of this seems to be a bit of a cruel and unusual experiment at best. See, for us who have life good, and for me who grew up in a loving home and I have a loving marriage and I have kids and I'm healthy and we live here in Southern Ontario where we can pursue all of our opportunities, I love life. But to somebody who was born in poverty and will die in poverty, or born a slave and die a slave, and spends their entire life suffering, what kind of a God would just allow that? Why wouldn't he just send us straight to heaven then? Then why do we even bother with this whole existence here on earth if we're all just going straight to heaven? Again, the challenge is, what do you believe about this? What do you believe about why you exist? What do you believe about why God allowed us to be here? But Revelation continues. It says, he who was seated at the throne said, I am making everything new. Then he said, write this down, for these are true. These words are trustworthy and true. He said to me, it is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give water without cost from the spring of the water of life. Those who are victorious will inherit all this, and I will be their God, and they will be my children. But the cowardly, unbelieving, vile, murderers, sexually immoral, and those practicing magic arts, the idolaters, and all liars, they will be consigned to the fiery lake of burning sulfur. This is the second death. And so we have to come to this conversation as part of suffering, that at some point God is going to deliver justice. At some point, things have to be made right. The issue with justice is, though, there's a couple of them. One is, don't we all have a different view on how we want others judged than we want to be judged ourselves? And then we take that into this conversation? How many of you guys would like a police officer, when they pull you over, to just give you the full fine that you deserve? Just a show of hands. Just for those watching online, there was no one. But if a loved one is killed in an accident because someone was speeding, do you not want the full book of the law to be thrown at that person? It's different when it's other people. Or when you make a mistake. Let's say you make a mistake. Let's say you're my son, Lexus, hypothetically. But that experience was so real to me, because as soon as it's my kid, I want the cop to be gentle and kind and caring. Because I know what a driver he is. I know that he's a good driver. At least that's what he tells me. Apparently some of you have seen him drive. Don't tell me otherwise. I want to believe what I believe. But when it's your own kid, don't you want them to be more lenient? Don't you want them to be more kind? But when your family member is injured in that accident, this is so interesting how different we are. And we have this view of justice that we want for other people, but then there's a whole different one for us. And when it comes to this conversation about heaven and hell, I feel like most people have a line of where they think of who should go to hell. And it's been so interesting to me, because I have a lot of friends who are not Christian, and so when we talk about any of this kind of stuff, everybody has a line. Can we all agree we think Hitler should go to hell? Okay, so we agree Hitler should go to hell. And then that line changes for everybody. But this idea of justice depends on what your view is. And then it depends on what your view of the justice system is. Some of y'all don't believe our justice system is fair. I can see you, you're smirking. If we did it like the States did it, in America, where there's real justice, right? Or the Mexican version of justice. You been to Mexico? Okay, so I grew up in Mexico till I was 3. But we visited lots. And have I ever told you the story of when my dad got chased in the minivan? Have you guys heard this story? I don't know if I've ever told you this. No? Okay, can I tell you a story? So we were in Cuauhtemoc, and if you guys know where the Rubio is, do you guys know where the Rubio is? Okay, okay? I don't either. I just don't remember the name, so don't ask for like where it is. I just know it's somewhere near Cooktamak. So my dad, anyway, we were driving a Aerostar. Do you guys remember these Aerostars? Not known for their power or speed. So my dad got pulled over by the cops, and so they had a dialogue, and I don't remember exactly what happened, but I do know that the cops often would want to, especially with foreigners, they'd take the license off the plates, or off the vehicle, so that you would be forced to come in and pay your dues. And my dad didn't want to give them any pesos, because my dad grew up in Mexico, so he's like, nah, I'm not giving you pesos. So anyways, cop sits down on the bumper of the van, and my dad decides this is a great time to floor it. This is not a made-up story. You can ask my mother, she's still mad. So my dad floors it. Cop goes, recovers, sadly, gets in the vehicle, proceeds to catch us because we were in Aerostar. And this time they come out with their little guns. Now, if you know my parents, my dad is probably laughing a little bit. We're all crying at this point. My mom gets out and starts yelling at the police officers. Like, this is the justice system that Mexico was. Now, you think to yourself, my goodness, your dad, like, if you did that out here, like, do we have any cops here right now? I just assume that's a ticket. Like, you're not allowed to do that. So they took my dad in. And my dad's like, I want to talk to the chief of police, who happens to be his buddy. And by evening, Dad was back with us, and that was the end of the story. Justice prevailed again. Right, so we talk about justice. It all depends on your own perspective. And we all go into it with a very skewed mindset, because we see it through the way we would like justice to be delivered. So what I want to do with this morning at least, and as we start into the next couple of weeks, I want to look at who this God who judges actually is. Because if you follow the court system at all, you'll understand that who the judge is matters significantly. So in the States and in Canada, who our Supreme Court is and which side of the spectrum they fall on matters a lot. And so who the judge is matters a lot, but who the judge is also changes a lot of how we respond. And so I want to start with reading out of Jonah. Jonah is one of my favorite books in the Bible, partially because it's just hilarious. I think it could sort of be a comedy if it wasn't so sad and ridiculous. But you have this story of a guy, and through his circumstances as we read it, I'm hoping you'll start piecing together why our view of God is so important in this conversation of suffering. So let me give you some context. If you guys are not familiar with the book of Jonah, you're reading from chapter 1 here. It says, the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. So we want to give some context. Jonah was a man of God, and Nineveh was a wicked city. So as you're placing yourself in this story, put yourself in a place where you've been asked to go speak to somebody who, on your standards or God's standards, you would at least define as wicked. Whatever that looks like to you. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed to Tarshish. I'm now picturing my dad trying to run from the police. I feel like it's sort of related. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. And paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed to Tarshish to flee from the Lord. So already you begin to ask the question, if you know how the way the story ends, just stay here, don't jump ahead. But why in the world is Jonah running? Why would Jonah run? I think his motive here speaks volumes to where so often our own hearts end up. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried to his own God, and they threw cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. Like, the whole thing is just a comedy. Like, you're in the middle of this violent storm, running from God, and you're just like, this is the best thing. I'm just going to go to sleep. So I don't know if he was just like hoping he would die or what would happen, because that seems to be a theme for his life. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. The captain went to him and said, "How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us, that we will not perish." And I'm assuming Jonah's like, "Please don't take notice of me, Lord." Anyways, then the sailors said to each other, "Come, let us cast lots and find out who's responsible for this calamity." They cast lots and it fell on Jonah. So they asked him, "Tell us, who's responsible for making all this trouble for us? What kind of work do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? From what people are you?" He answered, "I am a Hebrew and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and dry land." This terrified them. And he said, "What have you done?" The sea was getting rougher and rougher. So they asked him, what should we do to make the sea calm down?" "Pick me up and throw me into the sea," he replied. Again, this is going with his theme. If you later on, it seems to be a theme. But anyways, "Pick me up, throw me into the sea, and it will become calm. I know that this is my fault, and this great storm has come upon you." It's interesting to me, on a side note, I didn't say this in first service, but isn't it interesting that he never thought to repent? I don't know, like to me, again, I don't really like water. I certainly don't like drowning in water. I think that sucks. But he's just like, "You're going to need to throw me in. That's what's going to need to happen here." Okay. So they do. But listen to their response. I find this really fascinating. Again, because remember, Jonah was the man of God. But listen to the way they respond. So they're fighting for their life. They've realized it's his fault. He's given them the solution. And he said, it writes, "Instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. Then they cried out to the Lord, 'Please, Lord, do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, Lord, have done as you pleased.' Then they took Jonah, threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him." So you have this curious moment. Now again, some people say this is kind of like an Old Testament parable and this didn't really happen, and it was just a story that God is trying to say. And I hope it's real though, because if Jonah's a real person, I have a few questions. Like, he's one of the people that if he's real, I want to meet him in heaven, and I just want to be like we got some time on our hands now. Walk me through what was going through your head. Right? Like, if he's real, here's my thought. Now, I'm not that smart, but when the sea's calmed, he didn't think about surfacing? Like, that didn't cross your mind? But anyways, sorry, those are details that are completely irrelevant. So anyways, he doesn't surface, and a great whale comes and swallows him. Which some people say, again, this is again your belief in God. Somebody challenged me a couple years ago. They're like, "That's ridiculous. God could never do that. That's about, I've seen the size of a whale." If it were God, you don't think he could make this happen? Like, again, if God isn't real, he's not powerful, then clearly it's not true. But people are like, "This could never happen." Well, yeah, most of this should never happen. But if he can control the weather, that part doesn't bother you. It's whether or not he can control the whale. But anyways. Anyways, moving on. Chapter 3. Then the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. So now he's been spit up and puked out by the whale. It says, "Go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim to it the message I gave you." Jonah obeyed the word of the Lord this time and went to Nineveh. Good call. Now Nineveh was a very large city. It took 3 days to go through it. Jonah began by going a day's journey into the city proclaiming, 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. The Ninevites believed God. A fast was proclaimed, and all of them, from the greatest to the least, put on sackcloth. When Jonah's warning reached the king of Nineveh, he rose from his throne, took off his royal robes, covered himself in sackcloth, and sat down in the dust. Then he issued this proclamation to Nineveh. "By the decree of the king and his nobles, do not let people or animals, herds or flocks, taste anything. Do not let them eat or drink, but let people and animals be covered with sackcloth. Let everyone call urgently on God. Let them give up their evil ways and their violence. Who knows? God may yet relent and with compassion turn from his fierce anger so that we will not perish." When God saw what they did, and they turned from their evil ways, he relented, and he did not bring the destruction he had threatened. But to Jonah, this was very wrong, and he became angry. Isn't that curious? So here's Jonah, and he goes to this group, and he brings this message that you need to repent. And when they repent, his response is anger. See, I find it interesting and sad that when people think of the church and suffering, the word judgment is very high up in what they feel. I find it interesting that when we read a story like Jonah, we somehow feel like we're not like Jonah, and yet so much of what the church is known for is exactly what Jonah was doing. What is it about us that is so eager to see God judge and punish people? I find it so curious that the church is known for preaching so much about everybody going to hell and doing so little about preventing people from actually going there. There's an interesting, in John 9, there's an interesting conversation that Jesus has with his disciples. It says this, he says, he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? So there's this interesting dynamic that you often see within Christian people when we look at others who are suffering. And it's to try to find blame, to figure out who's responsible. How often when we go by somebody who's homeless, what's the first thing we think of? What did they do to get there? And we put this blame on them for getting to the place they're at. And what does that then do? It absolves us of having to do anything about it. When you think a lot of the areas that are suffering, you just think, well, if they would just live better, if they'd make better choices, if they'd this, but I'm not now responsible. The disciples wanted to know, this guy was born blind, and they're like, who sinned? Who's responsible? And we look to blame those who are suffering instead of doing anything about it. Listen to it. Let's carry on with Jonah here. Listen to what he does. But to Jonah, this seemed very wrong, and he became angry. He prayed to the Lord, isn't this what I said, God, when I was still at home? That is why I was trying to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. I knew that you were merciful and slow to anger, but I didn't think those people deserved it. Who are those people in your life? Who are those people that you're just eager to see God judge? I don't know what it is about Christianity that makes us so wanting to see others judged. I've never understood it. It bothers me so much that we seemingly are so eager to see all these other people suffer. To me, I'll be honest, I hope everybody shows up in heaven. I know it doesn't answer some of my questions. I have no desire to see anybody punished. But somehow the church has this thing where we so deeply desire God to punish people. But Jonah here is like, I know that my response is not like God's response. That's why I didn't want to do your work, because then all of a sudden you're going to forgive them, and I know you're going to forgive them. And listen, he carries on. And now, Lord, take away my life, for it is better for me to die than to live. But the Lord replied, is it right for you to be angry? Jonah had gone out and sat down in a place east of the city. There he made himself a shelter, sat in the shade, and waited to see what would happen to the city. Still sitting in a place, just waiting. Maybe God will still do something. Maybe he'll still burn them down. Let's go back to Jesus' response here for a second. In John 9. So they've asked him, they said, okay, so why is this guy blind? Who do we blame? Is it his fault? His parents' fault? Listen to what he does here. He says, neither this man nor his parents sinned, But this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. So it's interesting, his perspective. He said this man was blind and he is suffering. And part of his perspective was that what he now gets to do is to give God glory by being his hands and feet here in this situation. And so he saw this suffering, and instead of judging the man, instead of trying to blame or condemn or do any of that, he said, listen, this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work, but while I'm in the world, I will be the light of the world. After saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with his saliva, put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. See the difference in response, the difference in outcome. And there's endless stories of the way Jesus dealt with people who we would say are evil. But Jesus' goal was always hoping that they would accept God's grace, hoping that they could be redeemed, hoping that they could be restored. But go back to Jonah now. So Jonah's sitting there, angry, waiting for the city to die. So he makes himself a shelter, sat in the shade, and waited to see what would happen. Then the Lord provided a leafy plant and made it grow over Jonah to give him shade for his head, to ease his discomfort. And Jonah was happy about the plant. But at dawn, God provided his next present, a worm, which chewed the plant so that it withered. When the sun rose, God provided a scorching east wind. Look at God providing. And the sun blazed on Jonah's head, and he grew faint. And we all know what he now wanted to do. He wanted to die. Yes, he did. And said, it would be better for me to die than to live. But God said to Jonah, is it right for you to be angry about the plant? Oh man, I hope Jonah's a real person. I want to talk to him about these moments. It is, he said. And I'm so angry, I wish I were dead. God's like, yeah, I know, I've heard, I've noticed, it's a bit of a theme. But then listen to what God says here. And this is really where the rubber meets the road in this story. And the Lord said, you have been concerned about this plant, though you did not tend it or make it grow. It sprang up overnight and died overnight. And should I not have concern for the great city of Nineveh, in which there are more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left? For the follower of Jesus, we believe at some point God is going to deliver justice. What that means for us in this life is that we get off our throne of justice and we begin to move towards the dark, move towards those who are suffering, move towards those who are filled with wickedness, move towards all of those who try to bring light. But the church, for whatever reason, we get so caught up in judging and saying who's going here and who's going where. This is what Jesus did here for the blind man, is just poured love on him, gave him hope, helped reduce his suffering. My hope for our church, because I can't control the global church. We can control what we can control. But my hope for our church is that when people tell the story of Mount Salem Community Church, they tell the story of a church who cared for people when they were suffering. And whether that suffering was with mental illness, whether that suffering was even by their own choices, whether that suffering was with the endless different ailments that people struggle with, whether they're physical, emotional, sexual, whatever that may be, my hope is that for us as a church, that we lean into their suffering, that we become the hands and feet of Jesus and love on them and care for them and allow God to do his job of judging. See, when it comes to suffering, most of our conversation about suffering isn't us suffering. Most of our conversation is actually what we're going to do with the world around us that's suffering so incredibly much. A lot of that has to do with we grew up in families that were awesome, and our parents did a good job, and a lot of you parents are doing great jobs. And so as you're growing in your family, you guys have joy and you have peace. We're in a land where we can make our own living. But there's so many, even here, who are suffering who do not have that. If I believe that God is going to be just at the end of my life, that also means I'm going to be held accountable for what I'm going to do. And what I know about God is that he cares deeply for those who are suffering. And so we as a church want to be on the forefront of that. That if you're suffering, the last thing you feel from the church is judgment. You feel hope, you feel faith, you feel joy, and you feel a community come around you saying there is hope. That's who we want to be. That's who I believe we're called to be. That's who God was for us. Let's pray. Father God, the way you love us is unreal. God, the way that you are so gracious to us is unbelievable. And God, as I'm reading the story of Jonah, I wish I didn't relate so well to what he felt, but I do. I wish I didn't relate so well to the self-righteousness that I get caught up in, but I do. So God, I just want to confess that I get caught up in the same things that Jonah did. I get caught up in feeling I'm better than other people, and I get caught up in feeling that others, that I've earned what I have here. So God, I just pray that you will give us as a church an incredible humility to be reminded that all of us are here by your grace. And that the things that we've been given, we are to steward and steward well. And so, Father, as we go into this week, and this is going to apply in everybody in a different way, but wherever we interact with suffering, God, may we have compassion. May we have kindness. May we give people the kind of experience that they felt when they came in contact with Jesus. Father, thank you for the way you love us. Thank you for this community, for this family. Love you. For this in your name, amen.